One of the massive benefits of modern smartphones is that, for the most part, their cameras are exceptional. They can capture every detail of your life that you want to in high fidelity in nearly every lighting condition. And they're so good that, to some extent, it feels as if progress is stagnated. It's easy to ask the question, where do we go from here? Because it feels like we've maxed out the tech you can stuff into the backside of a metal slab that you stare at for hours. And while I'm not going to try to answer where smartphone cameras go from here, I realize that maybe I don't fully value just how good things are currently. So in order to help me appreciate just how far all of the advancements have come, I decided to go and purchase every single iPhone that had a different camera. Some of them we already had from over the years, but in total, we're looking at 31 distinct iPhones with something unique about their camera setup. Certain iPhones, like the iPhone 5C, had the exact same hardware as the iPhone 5, or the later iPhone SEs being identical to the iPhone 8, so those won't be showcased here. And as I researched for this video, I was actually fascinated about all the design changes that have developed through the 18-year history of the iPhone, and noticing key distinct trends that Apple decided to implement into their pixel pausers. And just as a side note, I know there's a lot of Android phones that implemented certain features ahead of Apple here and set the trend, like with night mode being available on the Pixels years before the iPhone, but the scope of the video is mostly going to stay in the Apple framework. Because there's a lot that takes us from the 2 megapixel camera on the original iPhone to the Pro Max camera bump that's close to 30% of the entire size of the OG. I mean, the lens is smaller than the flash or LiDAR on the new flagship phone. But with all the changes, I decided to break up the camera journey into 4 main categories just to help mentally compartmentalize everything in a way that's easy to follow. So those 4 are the only rear camera years, the original iPhone through the 3GS where there was no easy way to frame a selfie. Then there's the single rear camera years, the iPhone 4 through the 6S Plus. All of these phones have a front-facing camera, but there's no real choices in how you take pictures. Then there's the yes, very good. Double rear camera years. That's the generation of the 7 through the 10S Max. And finally, the generation that carries us through today and isn't likely to change with the 17 series. We're in the triple camera years. So let's start our trip down memory lane with the revolutionary mobile phone, the iPhone. As mentioned, this is the simplest generation in terms of cameras. The 2007 phone and its successor, the 3G, shared the exact same details for the camera. A 2.0 megapixel sensor that wasn't just limited in hardware, but also software. There's no HDR, no video recording, no user-controlled focusing. It's as simple as point and click, and you get geotagging thrown in too. The 3GS gets some major usability improvements, a 66% increase in megapixels to go up to a full 3, which is combined with some video capabilities. Yes, the 3GS is Apple's first video phone capable of 480p recording at 30 frames per second, and it introduces the helpful software feature of tap to focus so that you can have more control over what you want to highlight in your photos and videos. But after the 3GS, Apple did a lot of redesigning, not just with the body of the phone, since this is where we get our true rectangular brick-shaped phone, but also with everything involved in taking pictures. It's the generation where it seems like Apple decided that the camera was going to be more than just an aspect of the iPhone, but rather a major core feature. The iPhone 4 became the first iPhone with a front-facing camera. It's only 0.3 megapixels, but includes a lot of the software enhancements the original iPhone missed with its 2 megapixel camera. Tap to focus and 480p 30 FPS video are both included with the selfie taker. The 300 kilopixels means that the quality isn't the greatest, but it's way easier to frame than turning your phone around. Which, around the back of the iPhone 4, there is an overhaul. LED flash is implemented to help make low light photos better, but you also get a backside illuminated sensor to help with that as well. The sensor is also capable of 5 megapixel photos through its redesigned 4-element lens. And this is the first iPhone to get a zoom feature. A 5x digital zoom is included in the camera app, along with the ability to capture HD video at 30 frames per second. The iPhone 4S builds on the 4's huge advancements with some of its own, at least on its backside. The front-facing camera is the same third of a megapixel, so nothing new there. But on the rear, it gets bumped up from 5 megapixels to 8, gets a Sony sensor, the Exmor R IMX145, and it also builds in an IR filter with a new 5-element lens. Apple starts to disclose the aperture of the camera with this generation as well, with the 4S having an f2.4. And probably most importantly, it's the first iPhone with digital image stabilization for photos only. And because of the bump in processing power with the A5 chip, it's also the first iPhone to get image signal processing and face detection in photos. That ISP means that theoretically you should get higher quality photos and better colors. The video on this also jumped up from 720p to 1080p, still stuck at just 30 FPS. The iPhone 5 doesn't change a ton, keeping the same 8 megapixel rear camera as the 4S, but improved the low light performance and has 40% faster photo capture. It also adds panorama photos. Unfortunately, it was also known to defectively give photos a purple haze/hue, causing a big controversy at the time. Our current model that I picked up off of eBay doesn't suffer from this problem, but let me know in the comments if you had one that did. And from using this phone, this is what I deem the good enough iPhone. This is when the camera looks reasonably modern and usable on the rear and front cameras. The low light improvements also make it serviceable for anyone not taking professional photos. I wouldn't say that this is where the iPhone peaked, but the 5's improvements are enough to where I think it's again serviceable in 2025. The front camera on the 5 does quadruple in megapixels to 1.2 and gets 720p 30 video recording, up from the 480p it was previously. And the iPhone 5C didn't change anything from the 4S or the 5. It had a different camera assembly to fit into the body of the phone, but everything on the picture taking side of things stayed identical. The iPhone 5S makes a lot of huge strides over the 5. It's the first to get a custom sensor from Sony, an 8 megapixel 1/3 of an inch custom Exmor RS with a slightly larger aperture of f2.2 instead of 2.4, and it has a 30mm focal length. It's also the first phone to get the dual color true tone flash and to go beyond 30 FPS in video with a 720p 120 FPS slow-mo mode. And it wasn't just the video that got faster. The 5S also got a burst photo mode. The true tone flash is supposed to make it so that it's more evenly illuminated for people's skin tones and keeping colors accurate when you're in a low light situation. But the front kept the same sensor as the 5, but introduced a 10 frame per second burst mode, an f2.4 aperture, auto HDR for photos, and digital image stabilization, the first iPhone to stabilize the selfies. Now for the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. This generation actually makes significant history since it was the first iPhone with a camera bump. It's a small lip compared to the massive mountains we have now, but this is where your phone not lying flat on a surface started. There's no real change to the camera hardware here actually, but it's included because it introduces a whole host of new features on top of its protrusion around the lens. Regular video recording goes up to 60 FPS at 1080p, and slow-mo doubles to 240 frames at 720p. It also adds time lapses and photo stills taken directly from the videos. And the big kahuna upgrade for the 6 is that its autofocus got upgraded to be phase detection, making it quicker, more reliable, and accurate. The front increased the aperture to f2.2 instead of 2.4 on the 5S, and it got a few software enhancements as well, namely exposure control and face detection, making it easier for you to make sure your face is in focus and looks properly illuminated. The 6 Plus is here not because it has any sensor changes from the regular 6. The front is 100% identical, and the rear is also the same except for the inclusion of optical image stabilization, a huge boon for us shaky-handed folk. But this is also the phone that started Bendgate, so it's a mixed legacy for Apple here. And optical image stabilization is a big deal because it shakes the lens around in tandem with your hand to make sure that you're actually capturing something that doesn't look like a massive blur. And now we hit the last phone generation in the single camera years. The 6S changes quite a bit from the 6. It's the first to get 4K video, only at 30 FPS thanks to its 12 megapixel sensor, and slow-mo adds a 1080p 120 mode in addition to the 720p 240. Time lapses get stabilization, panoramas add 20 megapixels to go to 63 since the 6 was only capable of 43 megapixel panoramas, and it keeps the same setup with the 6 and 6 Plus where the 6S Plus just gets optical stabilization. Also, with the bump to 4K, they become the first iPhones to offer 8 megapixel stills from the video. They're also the first ones to offer live photo. That's when there's a little video recording taken before and after you snap your photo. And as someone who took dozens of photos with each of these phones for this video, it was a mistake not to turn that off since I had to parse through all of the files just being extra in all of the pictures that I took from these phones here on out. But the front camera quadruples on the 6S and 6S Plus up to 5 megapixels with no new features except for retina flash to illuminate your face, making it easier to take selfies in dark environments. The 6S and its Plus variant close out the single rear camera years with 12 megapixel sensors. And you better get used to that because it's going to stay like that for a long while. So for the next section, just know that every single rear camera is stuck at that one short of a baker's dozen size. Now we're gonna start the double rear camera years with a few phones that do only have a single camera, but they were released at the same time, so timeline-wise, this is where it begins. And it's also when Apple stopped referring to their pixel preservers as eyesight cameras, interestingly enough. The iPhone 7, with its single camera, makes some major strides with the technical aspects, even if the megapixel count won't change. It also is the iPhone that removed the headphone jack. The camera gets bigger, comes with a new second generation Sony Exmor RS sensor, has a 6-element lens, doubles the LED flash to be a quad LED true tone, and increases the aperture to f1.8 for better low light performance. And just as a note for any non-photo people, I said increase the aperture to 1.8, even though that's a smaller number than the previous 2.4 or 2.2, and that is because it denotes the size of the hole that lets in light. The lower the number, the bigger the hole, therefore more light, technically better for low light performance. Hope that helps. Nothing changes with video recording options though, but the 7 is the first to get high efficiency formats for its captures, and it's the first non-Plus phone to have built-in optical image stabilization for its camera. For the second phone generation in a row, there is an increase to megapixel count on the front, bumping up from 5 to 7, which also comes with the addition of 1080p front video on its f2.2 aperture. And to be truthful, if I was forced to choose the oldest iPhone I was comfortable with to use in 2025, this would be it. All of the advancements in the 7 series really make it comprehensively a more usable phone camera setup than the previous generations. It's lacking some of the quality of life features that come after it, but it's good enough to really not be too far behind what's posted on most people's social medias, especially if the lighting's good. The 7 Plus gets all of that goodness, but becomes the first iPhone to add a second rear camera. This is a 12 megapixel telephoto that has a focal length of 56 millimeters and provides essentially a 2x optical zoom, which also allows the digital zoom to increase to 10 times. The telephoto camera has an aperture of f2.8, but does not come optically stabilized like the main camera, which is a shame since zooming in means more shakies. Apple then moved on to their longest running camera that they made, the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus generation. The main camera on these not only continued to be sold with the 8s until just before the pandemic, but they also resurfaced in the second and third gen iPhone SEs. The second gen SE had the 8's camera, but with the 11 software enhancements, and the third gen SE had the 8 camera, but with the 13 software enhancements. And it's really easy to see why Apple stuck with this for the longest time. It has everything the modern person could probably realistically need or want. The video recording was bumped up to 4K 60 frames per second, and the slow motion increased to 240 frames per second at 1080p. And it was the first to introduce their slow sync flash with the quad LED true tone setup. The slow sync made it so that the shutter for taking the picture was slower, but the flash fired quicker, which resulted in better overall exposure of photos in darker environments. This one camera kinda did it all. But again, we're in the double rear camera era, and the 8 Plus still has that secondary telephoto lens. It doesn't really have any hardware enhancements from the 7 Plus, but rather this is the introduction of Apple's portrait mode, which required the use of the second camera, so it was exclusive to the Plus, and allegedly also needed the A11 SoC processor that was included in the 8 series, hence why it didn't get bumped down to the 7 Plus. Maybe it was just to sell more iPhones. The front cameras on the 8 and 8 Plus remain unchanged from the iPhone 7 though. And now we come to the X10, however pedantic you want to be, which continues to use the beefy setup introduced to the iPhone 8 as its main wide-angle camera, but they chose to enhance the telephoto this time. The aperture gets bigger, going from f2.8 to 2.4, again smaller number but bigger hole. The autofocus gets better on this lens, with it adding phase detection autofocus, and it's the first secondary camera to get optical stabilization to make the shakies disappear. But even though the main hardware improvements went to the telephoto, the main camera received a bunch of enhancements thanks to Apple's revamped software and the new A11 Bionic. Instead of single pixel phase detection autofocus, it got bumped up to dual pixel phase detection to make it more reliable and accurate. They added new gyroscopes and accelerometers for accurate motion tracking for the action camera user, and the new image signal processor on the phone did real-time lighting estimation for better video quality. They also enhanced the quad LED flash so that it gave twice the uniformity of light, and combined with slow sync from the iPhone 8 to really enhance low light photos. The front camera stayed the same hardware wise, but added slow-mo video going up to 720p 240 frames per second, and this is where animojis were added. Using the true depth camera on the front and the A11 Bionic chip, you could animate a cartoon or something. I've never used it to this day, I'm sure plenty of yins did when it launched though. The XS and XS Max follow up with a revamp of the sensor, becoming a 1/2.55 inch sensor instead of the 1/3.0 inch. So that means the sensor is bigger because if you divide 1 by that number, the number is bigger. Camera math's weird. So that means that this has better low light, larger pixel size of 1.4 micrometers instead of the 1.22 it had been, and it was also this generation that fixed one of the largest complaints of Apple's video recording up until this point. They finally instituted stereo audio recording, whereas until now, every single phone had been mono, even though the Android competition had had stereo recording for years. The front camera also gets a video enhancement, but that comes in the form of 1080p 60 FPS video recording. They also get gyroscoping electronic image stabilization to make getting those selfies easier for the vibrating digit folks like me. Now, the XR is an interesting phone. Technically, it has the exact same camera as the XS and XS Max, but with some key downgrades. The XS's have dual pixel phase detection autofocus, while the XR only has the regular phase detection, and that front camera image stabilization is also absent. So it's basically the same, but slightly worse. And that's how we'll end the story of the dual rear camera years, talking about yet another single camera phone, the XR. And of course, we're gonna start the triple camera years by talking about a double lens fella in the iPhone 11. This generation was controversial because it was when the power adapter and earpods got removed from the phone box. But they did seriously change up the camera with this gen. We're sticking with 12 megapixels still, but this dual camera setup is different than its predecessors. Now, it's not a normal lens and a telephoto for zooming, but rather an ultra wide and a normal lens. The main lens is essentially the same as the XS, but everything to do with it and around it has changed. The camera app got overhauled this generation to provide more control. Apple added in Deep Fusion AI machine learning image processing to help enhance the captures. Yep, AI in 2019. Automatic night mode also got built in, as well as audio zoom, which helps to focus the noise in the video to what you're trying to visually highlight. And the flash changed back to a dual LED situation instead of quad LEDs, but no brightness appears to be lost in the fewer diodes. And from my perspective, this is where the iPhone starts to have major marginal gains from here on out. Yes, from a technicality point of view, there are massive upgrades still to be made over the next few generations of phones, but the 11 is the phone that I'd say you could use and get 80 to 90% of what the 16 does these days. The main things that achieve that are the ultra wide, but mostly the night mode. That's a huge gain for normal phone users. Giving people the ability to take much better photos in poor lighting conditions is addressing a vast majority of use cases that non-photogs are taking their pictures in, and the 11 series really make strides. The front camera gets some major upgrades. It bumps up to 12 megapixels, its first increase since the 7 megapixel installation on the iPhone 7. It gets slightly wider at 23 millimeters with an f2.2 aperture and 1 micrometer pixels. The biggest enhancement is that 4K 60 FPS video recording is now possible, and so is slow-mo 1080p 120 FPS capture, which Apple at the time dubbed the Slowfie. Catchy name. Hope it really does catch on. The ultra-wide lens definitely was an overhaul and stays a standard for the rest of the lineup as the main secondary lens. It has a slightly lower aperture at f2.4 and doesn't have optical image stabilization, but expands the field of view to 120 degrees with its 13mm focal length. Ultra-wide being on the base level phone instead of a telephoto setup is argued to be better for normal folks since they have no problem digitally zooming in, but had no way to zoom out until now. Not everyone agrees with this choice, but if you wanted an optical zoom, well, you'd have to shell out for Apple's first Pro label phone. The iPhone 11 Pro and Pro Max are fundamentally the same in terms of cameras despite their screen size. The main rear camera, ultra-wide, and front camera are similar to that on the regular iPhone 11, but the Pro Buds get that telephoto lens. 12 megapixels, 52 millimeters, giving you a 2x zoom, and its aperture gets bigger at f2.0 instead of 2.4 that it was on the previous models, but otherwise it's fundamentally the same as the 10S series. The 11 Pro does have a bit of video quirkiness thrown in though. In 4K 60 FPS recording with the rear cameras, you could only go from 0.5x zoom to 2x zoom instead of up to 6x zoom that you could in the other video modes, limiting its usefulness at that high resolution recording rate. Next up is the first mini phone release. The 12 and 12 mini are identical in camera setup, but they are not identical to the 11. The lens gets reconfigured to be a 7-element setup instead of 6, and comes with an f1.6 aperture instead of the 1.8 that had been standard, letting in 27% more light than what you got with the previous gen. The ultra-wide and front cameras, however, stay exactly the same. There were a few software upgrades with the 12 as well that gave support for night mode in the time-lapse configuration for both photos and videos, and it received 10-bit HDR Dolby Vision 4K 30 recording, giving more flexibility in editing colors on the movies that came out of the phone. The front camera also received night mode for the first time as well. Now, the bigger brother Pro models take a departure from the previous generation. Instead of sharing the exact same camera config, the 12 Pro and Pro Max differ in a fairly significant way. The 12 Pro features an f1.6 main camera, so a slight upgrade from the 11 Pro in the wide camera department. The ultra-wide and the telephoto are identical to what was in the predecessor. The main enhancement here is that it got a 3D LiDAR scanner for better depth mapping and unlocking a bunch of new functionalities for the iPhone when it comes to measuring and documenting environments. The 12 Pro also came with the same 10-bit Dolby Vision HDR recording as the 12, but with support for up to 60 FPS at 4K instead of just 30. And the 12 Pro Max actually uses its extra size to increase the sensor size over the 12 Pro. It's a 47% improvement, going from the 1/2.55 inches to 1/1.9 inches. And it has the same lens as the 12 Pro for its main wide camera, but changes how it does stabilization. It comes with a sensor shift optical image stabilization instead of a lens-based stabilization. Theoretically, since the sensor is lighter, it's much faster to adjust that than the lens, so you get more responsive stabilization. The telephoto also gets bumped up to 65 millimeters for the focal length, which provides a 2.5 times optical zoom instead of just the flat 2 that the previous models had, although the aperture is slightly lower at f2.2 instead of the 2.0 like it is on the Pro non-Max. The only similarities between the regular Pro and the Max are the ultra-wide and front lenses, as well as the new LiDAR sensor. The 13 and its mini variant are a significant improvement as well. Apple moved the lens to a diagonal alignment instead of vertical, not for fun aesthetics, but rather to fit in the larger sensor coming from the 12 Pro Max. The lenses on the wide and ultra-wide cameras appear to be the same as the previous gens, but the main camera gets 1.7 micrometer pixels, the same as the 12 Pro Max, and it gets the sensor shift image stabilization, bringing a major feature down from the flagship to the entry-level phone. The front camera gets no enhancements, however. The camera app, though, debuts cinematic mode, which allows you to do things like rack focus and create more artsy-looking photos. The 13 Pro and Max go back to sharing the exact same camera setup. The main camera gets larger pixels at 1.9 micrometers, but with a slightly larger aperture of f1.5 instead of 1.6. The big upgrade is to the telephoto that increased to a 77mm focal length, up from the 52 and 65 on the 12 Pro and Pro Max. This means that 3 times optical zoom was introduced, also allowing for a 15 times digital zoom. It did come with a compromise of an f2.8 aperture instead of f2 or 2.2, so it did let in a little bit less light. The ultrawide, however, increased its aperture to f1.8 from 2.4 and got way better autofocus with its phase detection setup, and this gen was the first to get macro mode with a much closer focusing distance to objects. The 3D LiDAR sensor stays, but there are some video recording enhancements. Adding on to the Dolby Vision HDR recordings, these were the first generation to get ProRes recording, a fancy video codec. There were a few weird restrictions since the file size can get out of hand for this setting. The 256GB and up models could record at ProRes at 4K 30 or 1080p 60, whereas the base level 128GB could only do that at 1080p 30. The front cameras, however, are the exact same that you find in the iPhone 11. There's no upgrades here. The iPhone 14 series ditches the mini variant for a chunkier Plus option. Again, identical as far as cameras are concerned. These keep the same larger pixels on its main camera of the 13 Pro and Pro Max of 1.9 micrometers, but with an f1.8 lens instead of 1.5. But nothing really changes on the ultra-wide lens. They did increase the brightness on the flash by 10% to help with that lower aperture though. They do get 4K 60 Dolby Vision recording, something that was limited to Pro models before this, and it's the first series to introduce action mode, which adds extra electronic stabilization by cropping in on the sensor to reduce shaking and fast-moving videos. The other big software improvement is that it received lens correction for each of the camera modes, giving you less distortion for all your snaps. The front camera finally changes, the first time since the iPhone 11. The megapixels stay at 12, but the aperture goes from f2.2 to 1.9, letting in more light. But notably, this is the first front camera to get autofocus with its phase detection setup. I know, I can't believe it either. According to Apple's own press release, their front cameras couldn't do autofocus until 2022, a dozen years after they were first introduced. What also lasted a lot longer than you'd expect was the 12 megapixel era for these cameras, but that finally ends with the 14 Pro and Pro Max, which share the same camera specs just like the 13 Pros. The main camera gets a 65% larger sensor, which allows them to hit the 48 megapixel mark. But notably, it was by default set up to take pictures in 12 megapixels, but get much higher quality results using a process called pixel binning. You could activate the 48 MP mode by using the Pro RAW settings though. The main camera kept the f1.8 aperture of the non-pros, but with much smaller pixels at 1.22 micrometers, and the telephoto stays the same as the 13 Pro and Pro Max, but there were significant enhancements to the ultra-wide. It had a lower aperture of f2.2 down from 1.8, but that compromise came with dual pixel phase detection autofocus for much better performance and some lens improvements for enhanced clarity. The front camera on the 14 Pro and Pro Max are identical to that on the iPhone 14, but in addition to getting that autofocus, these were the first to get optical image stabilization. The 15 and its Plus sibling are the first non-Pro iPhones to get the 48 megapixel treatment. The aperture also increases from the 14 series to go to f1.6. Otherwise, it's mostly the same this generation, including the ultra-wide, which doesn't change much. The main improvement from the 48 MP update is that you can now do a sensor zoom to effectively get a 2 times optical zoom on the camera. The front camera on the 15 is the same as the 14, including not having optical stabilization. But bumping up to the Pro and Pro Max gives us the second time where there's a difference between the two phones. The 15 Pro and Pro Max share the same 48 megapixel main camera that comes from the 14 Pro series. And that also applies to the ultra-wide camera and the front camera. In fact, the only thing that's different on the 15 Pro from the 14 Pro is its ability to record spatial video for the Apple Vision Pro because of the swapped positioning of the ultra-wide and telephoto lenses. The 14 Pro series has the ultra-wide on the right side of the camera array, whereas the 15 Pro series had it directly on top of the main camera, which is allegedly necessary for the 3D video capturing. There is also a software change which gives you a new default main camera setting. On that main lens, you can now choose what your default focal length is, 24, 28, or 35 millimeters, all chosen from cropping in on that sensor. The 15 Pro Max, however, introduces Apple's 120 millimeter periscopic telephoto lens. The 12 megapixel f2.8 lens is capable of 5 times optical zoom and has 3D sensor shift optical image stabilization for the super zoomed in image, making sure your twinging hands get counteracted in more directions. And that brings us to the current generation before Apple changes things up with the massive camera on the 17 lineup, or at least the massive camera bar. The 16 and its Plus variant are again identical and go back to having the two cameras vertically stacked instead of diagonally to allow for the main iPhone to capture spatial video for the Vision Pros that everyone is definitely buying. The main and ultra-wide camera are nearly identical, except the ultra-wide camera gets dual pixel phase detection autofocus, something that was exclusive to the Pro lineup since the 14 series. The front-facing camera has no changes. The only real revamp besides camera positioning and autofocusing was the addition of the camera control button. The easy to accidentally trigger button is supposed to act like a scroll wheel to select aperture, focal length, and snap the picture, something you couldn't easily do before by touching the screen. The 16 Pro and Pro Max are once again unified in their camera situation, and they change very little from the previous 15 Pro series. The main camera is identical, but the periscope lens gets added to the non-Max phone. So 120 millimeter zoom is available on both the 16 Pro and Pro Max. The ultra-wide sees a bit of an upgrade to 48 megapixels instead of the 12 that it's been since it was introduced on the iPhone 11. The biggest enhancement is that the Pro lineup can now film in 4K 120 FPS. Otherwise, it's a bit of a minor upgrade from the previous gen, especially since you can only do that recording on the main lens, not on the ultra-wide or the periscope. And then lastly comes the iPhone SE replacement, the 16e. This is, oddly enough, the first E series to have its own camera. The 16 has a 48 megapixel f1.6 26mm camera, and if you just look at specs, so does the 16e, but the 16e has a much smaller sensor than the 16, which gives it slightly worse performance overall. The 16e is at a 1/2.55 inch sensor, the same size that was introduced on the iPhone 12, whereas the iPhone 16 is at a much larger 1/1.56 inches. The Pro lineup, by comparison, is even bigger still at 1/1.28 inches, getting very close to that 1-inch sensor mark. The big advantage that happens with the 16e versus the previous SE gens is that because of the 48 megapixels, it can crop in on the sensor to also provide a 2 times optical-like zoom, giving you effectively 2 cameras in one. And thus ends the history of the iPhone camera lineup. We're likely still to be in the triple rear camera era for at least this next generation of phones. And while the 16 lineup isn't much different than the 15, we have come a tremendously long way from the original 2007 launched iPhone. So I want to spend the next bit of time showcasing that. We showed you examples from each phone during the course of the video, but now let's stack them up next to each other so you can see exactly how each phone increased its quality or didn't. Obviously, each iPhone was capable of taking photos, so there's 31 different phones to sort through when it comes to the primary camera. In studio lighting or outdoors, even the early iPhones are noticeably rough, low resolution, grainy, and generally just they look old. Let's not even talk about how unusable those are in low light situations. As mentioned though, the 5 is really where things start to improve in quality, studio, outdoors, and low light. And once we hit the iPhone 7, that's where I'd say it's the lowest that I accept in quality for the modern age. It's not the best, but it's still good enough. And again, the 11 is where things level off majorly in my opinion. For normal folks, that is. Pixel peepers, heavy photo users, and enthusiasts will benefit from the extra resolution and changes in focal length and aperture and increase in sensor size from the next few generations, but it's mostly marginal benefits. The telephoto or zoom lenses settle in a bit early at the iPhone X. Once you add optical stabilization to the extra punched-in camera, taking photos in every lighting condition gets easier. Considering the telephoto wasn't added until the 7 Plus, it's already quite good enough from the jump, but there are improvements, especially in the total amount of zoom you get once you hit the 15 Pro Max and 16 Pros. You're essentially getting way better quality further and further out once you go down the generations, but the quality at each camera's native zoom level is good from the beginning. Ultra-wide is essentially great from the start as well. The 11 debuts this style of camera, and it has all the software features necessary to take advantage of it. The biggest enhancement joins with the 13 Pro, which adds the macro mode, giving you much better focusing and higher quality really close to subjects, but otherwise every ultra-wide on the iPhone is good from the get-go. Now, comparing the video, obviously we don't get anything until the 3GS and the 480p video, which it exists. It's not good, it's just there. The jump to 720p on the 4 doesn't enhance much, but the LED flash definitely supplements in the darker situations. Similar to the photos, the iPhone 5's video is the base level quality I'd want from a phone, with the 7 being the standard I'd really want. Optical image stabilization is huge on video, and it's noticeable once it's implemented. And you also get the 4K enhancements that debuted in the 6S series. And the 11 also is just so good that I don't think most people need anything beyond it. Obviously, there's been some massive enhancements in recent years for true professionals with ProRes, ProRAW, and the like. Cinematic mode introduced on the 13 is fine, and I can see some normal people taking use of it, but it feels like it's limited for select scenarios. The action mode on the 14 would be the bigger video upgrade, where you have a much higher level of stabilization from the sensor crop. Taking videos of kids, pets, and fast-moving sparrows just got a lot easier on that gen. But the quality of the video itself seems like it leveled off for most people again with the 11. And if we're talking about front facing, if you look through it, again, it's very similar. The 5 is where it gets good, the 7's kind of where it stops being all that important to upgrade, and with the 11, you're just, it's all good enough. Looking back on this journey, it's again a massive jump from the initial iPhone that's now a legal adult until the current generation. But diminishing returns did hit later than I was expecting. Most of it was in the way of practical upgrades that were made to make photo or video taking either easier or simpler for the average person. Stabilization being introduced for the normal phone folks at the iPhone 7 was one of those jumps. The night mode introduction was the bigger one with the 11, and I'd argue we haven't really had another massive end user usability improvement since that. There's been technical improvements, sure, but I think Apple's been trying to find that one thing that helps to make their phones better for the average person with things like the camera button. And while it's helpful, it doesn't fundamentally change the experience or quality of what people want out of their smartphone camera. And honestly, I didn't expect to love the 11 as much as I did, but it really satisfies most of what I see my friends and family using their phones for, even in 2025. I personally like to have way better zoom photos, so I've typically opted to use the Pro models myself. But if you've ever gone to a public gathering and saw people pinching to zoom on their iPad cameras, you'll know it's a nice to have, but not a substantially enhancing feature for most people. So ultra-wide and regular lens is where it's at. And I'm kind of really curious where Apple takes it from here. Is there any novelty that they can derive that will make these cameras better for people, or will it just continue to be gimmicks like spatial video for their $3,500 headsets?